Okay, so to get us through the end of God of Small Things, I am going to make a few comments, turn off the video, read a little more, make some more comments. I want to give you some support and some guidance. I'm sure there's lots of other things that you all are noticing or have questions about. So please, the best thing would be if you put those in a comment string under wherever I post the video on Google Classroom, because other people will undoubtedly benefit from your questions and comments and connections. I'm going to jump in and start at the end of chapter 8, which was the play when Sophie Mull gets home. And there's this really delicately, minutely described interplay of really dysfunctional family dynamic. And you see through lots of different viewpoints. And the thing I usually do in class for that is we go up on the board and we draw a picture of it, and there's just, resentment going every which way, along with some other emotions. But I want to start by looking at the end of that chapter on page 177. This is when the kids are playing. And, Rahel and Esther have really mixed feelings about Sophie Mull, loved from the very beginning, right? She seems to enjoy this kind of unconditional love that they don't quite feel in their world. And we have them on 177, little girls playing, sweet, one beach colored, one brown, one loved a little less. Now, presumably this is Rahel's perspective. So, she's the one who's connecting, feeling brown and loved less. Let's leave one alive so that it can be lonely, Sophie Mull suggested. Rahel ignored her and killed them all. So, the book is God of Small Things, right? So here we have an example of a sort of micro cruelty, how the small and the big is relative. So in this scene, from the aunt's perspective, Rahel is big, right? She's killing them. So she is like playing out that crushing of small things. And so, yeah, there's this idea of cruelty being cyclical. But also, I think the way the book zooms in to concerns with ever smaller lives and levels of lives. All right, so that's what I wanted to point out there on 177, and I'll be back in a little while with more. All right, now I'm in the beginning of chapter 9, and want to point out real quick on page 180 here, we have Sophie Mull kind of proving herself to the other kids. And the reason I'm stopping here is I just want to say that I think that Roy's grasp of the interplay amongst children is really fine, and it brings to mind for me things like To Kill a Mockingbird or Tom Sawyer, or other stories that really get down into the lives of children in a really real and very insightful way. We also have on the top of 181 Velutha, and one of the descriptions of how sweet he is with the kids, how respectful he is of them. And, we've had hints already, but this idea that he is the God of small things, right? And so this idea that he is, it's almost Benjaminian, right? He completely recognizes them as individuals with agency. Okay, I'm back on the top of page 182. We have here Rahel and Esther, okay, and this is in the now. And they're described as a pair of actors trapped in a recondite play with no hint of plot or narrative, unable somehow to change plays. And it says, or purchase for a fee some cheap brand of exorcism from a counselor with a fancy degree, who would sit them down and say, in one of many ways, you are not the sinners, you are the sinned against. So I want to make the argument that given that we're talking about them in terms of actors in a play, and we have this line, you're not the sinners, you're the sinned against, that this is a little Lear allusion, when Lear, of course, said, I am more sinned against than sinning. And this idea of being the sinned against. I don't know. There's so much of classic Western literature referred to in this novel, and I'm going with that as a Lear illusion. The other illusion that I see on this page is not an illusion. It's just me making one of those connections where it describes presumably Velutha as a victim. Same page down near the bottom here. Velutha, he left behind a hole in the universe through which darkness poured like liquid tar, through which their mother followed without even turning to wave goodbye. She left them behind, spinning in the dark with no moorings, in a place with no foundation. I can never get past this part without thinking of the song by Death Cab for Cutie, I Will Follow You Into the Dark. I'll put a link for the song. It's a beautiful, poignant song, and for me, that's right here, that Amu followed Velutha into the dark. Right. Okay, so I'm in chapter 10, The River in the Boat. So one thing I want to point out, there's page 187, the refrain in Esther's head is girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy. Twins were not allowed. The girl, boy thing emphasizes these binarisms and boundaries being blurred, because girl, boy, it's turned into one word. Then on page 187, about halfway down, a boat to row across the river. So Akara, the other side, the idea that the river forms this boundary between the one side and the other. And of course, Velutha and Amu, they crossing the river to be together, the twins crossing the river. And the river, on page 201, Katapin says, the river of ours, she isn't always what she pretends to be. So I'm sure you've noticed an ongoing personification of this river as this live thing. And on that same page, they talk about, this is the twins when they're first testing out this boat. It says at the bottom of 201, and a jeweled Jesus watching. He walked on water, perhaps, but could he have swum on land? And then this is Velutha who's watching them. And we see on the top of 202, Velutha returned to see if Katapin needed anything. So we talked about Velutha as this carpenter, possible Christ figure, and there he is referred to explicitly as a Jesus. All right, so in chapter 11, The God of Small Things, we have Amu sort of figuring out her attraction to Velutha. She has the dream about the one-armed man. We have this motif of leaving or not leaving footprints, which reminds me of the end of Beloved, when we find the only thing left is sometimes there are footprints by the river. Let's see. We have Amu mothering and her kind of mixed feelings about her children's need of her. At the beginning of the chapter, we have the description in the dream of the ridges of muscle on his stomach rose under his skin like divisions on a slab of chocolate. The chocolate slab abs have always made me laugh a little bit. Right. Okay. Chapter 12, Kochu Thomban. That's the Thomban is the elephant. And this is a long chapter, long description of Esther and Rahel sitting there watching the Kathakali dancers. And so on page 218, it explains how this traditional dance, how conflicted the dancers feel about participating in the commodification of their own culture. And it says on 218, on their way back from the Heart of Darkness, that's the new hotel, the resort, they stopped at the temple to ask pardon of their gods, to apologize for corrupting their stories, for encashing their identities, misappropriating their lives. So what Esther and Rahel are watching is their own sort of personal performance. And I posted a link to a YouTube thing of Kathakali dancing 2 weeks ago, and I'll repost that so you can see it and get a sense of what that's like. Okay, in chapter 13, The Pessimist and the Optimist, we have the story of Margaret and Chaco and their relationship. And One thing that I have starred here in the margin is on page 233, at the end of the first half of the page, where it says about Margaret, she was perhaps too young to realize that what she assumed was her love for Chaco was actually a tentative, timorous acceptance of herself. And I want to remind you, when we talked about the idea of distinguishing in a relationship between feelings about the other person and how enjoying how the other person makes you feel about yourself. So, yeah, that's a good moment of that. So she thinks she's loving him, but really what she's enjoying is that feeling of loving herself. Okay. All right. Okay, so thinking about being complicit in systems of domination. On the next part of this chapter, The Pessimist and the Optimist, on page 242, we learn that it was Valia Papan, that's Valutha's father, who told Mamachi about seeing the little boat cross the river. So he knows about Valutha and Amu's relationship, and he's the one who told, because you know, inside of himself, he is so invested in the system in which he grew up that you know, he betrays his son. Just a page or two later, we have a moment that Lady Mary Wollstonecraft would appreciate, because we have women complicit in the oppression of other women. Bibi Kochama and Kochu Maria locking Amu up, sending for Valutha. And so they, you know, they are punishing, controlling her for her violation, her transgression of the love laws. So the last part of chapter 14, we go into Valutha's perspective for a more extended period of time than we ever had. We've had snippets before. And it's described as being a dog, history walking the dog, and this idea that he's subject to these forces beyond his control, right? That there's these sort of inevitable gears moving. In chapter 15, the crossing, we have Valutha crossing the river, going to the history house. Things are accelerating here. Naked but for his nail varnish. So we know now that this red nail varnish that he wears, it's because he was playing with the kids, right? So that's related to him being the god of small things and being kind to the children. In chapter 16, this is where we finally learn about the death of Sophie Mall. And on the reading quiz that you're not going to have to take, one of the questions that students frequently don't get is how exactly, like what happened to the boat. And it's interesting how the detail just kind of slides by. On the bottom of page 276, they were past the really deep, only yards from the other side, when they collided with a floating log and the little boat tipped over. So the tipping is quiet, the prose is quiet when it happens. Esther and Rahel, of course, are strong swimmers. This is sort of their element, even though they didn't take into account exactly how tough the river was going to be. And we've got on the bottom of 277, she was gone, carried away on the muffled highway, gray-green with fish in it, with the sky and trees in it, and at night the broken yellow moon in it. And as many of you noticed early on, yellow is kind of her color. Just a quiet handing over ceremony, a boat spilling its cargo, a river accepting the offering, one small life, a brief sunbeam, with a silver thimble clenched for luck in its little fist. Okay.